Footage like this has become increasingly common across UK high streets. Security cameras capturing the same scene over and over. Different locations, different times, but the pattern remains strikingly similar. Walk into a store, select items from the shelves, and leave without paying. Sometimes there's hesitation, sometimes there's none at all. What used to be isolated incidents now appear with enough regularity that retail workers, security personnel, and local communities have begun to notice a shift. This isn't about a single dramatic event that made headlines for a day and then disappeared. This is about something that keeps happening, week after week, in cities and towns across the country. The question isn't whether retail theft exists. We've always known it does. The question is why it continues to repeat itself with such consistency, even as stores invest in new security measures, even as awareness grows, even as the issue receives more public attention. Something about the current environment seems to enable this cycle, and understanding why requires looking beyond any single factor. It requires examining how multiple pressures, limitations, and realities have aligned to create a situation where theft from retail spaces has become, for some, almost routine. The scenes captured on security footage show a range of behaviours, but certain patterns emerge when you watch enough of them. There are thefts that happen in broad daylight, during peak shopping hours, when stores are filled with customers and staff. There are individuals who move through aisles with apparent confidence, selecting items as if they were simply shopping, then walking past payment points without stopping. In some footage, there's a glance toward cameras or staff, an acknowledgement that they're being observed. In others, there's no visible concern at all. What strikes many retail workers isn't necessarily the boldness, though that's certainly present. It's the lack of urgency. There's rarely the frantic energy you might expect from someone doing something they know is wrong, and fear being caught for. Instead, there's often a calmness, a sense that this is something they've done before and expect to do again. Store employees describe watching these situations unfold and feeling uncertain about how to respond. Many retailers have policies that explicitly discourage staff from physically intervening, both for their own safety and to avoid potential legal complications. So they watch. Sometimes they document, sometimes they call for security or police, but often the person is already gone before any response arrives. This creates a strange dynamic where theft can happen in full view, with witnesses present, yet still proceed largely uninterrupted. The repetition of this dynamic, across multiple cities and different types of stores, suggests something deeper than individual opportunism. It suggests a broader understanding, whether conscious or not, that the risk of immediate consequences is relatively low. The impact of persistent retail theft ripples outward in ways that aren't always immediately visible. For large chain stores, losses are absorbed into broader operating costs, factored into pricing models, and addressed through corporate security strategies. For small independent retailers, however, the calculation is entirely different. Every item taken without payment represents a direct hit to already thin margins. There's the immediate cost of the stolen goods themselves, but that's just the beginning. There's the cost of increased security measures, from additional cameras to hiring security personnel, expenses that many small businesses can barely afford. There's the cost of higher insurance premiums as claims accumulate. There's the psychological cost on staff, who feel increasingly vulnerable and unsure of their role in these situations. Some retailers report reducing their operating hours, closing earlier to avoid peak theft times, which then reduces their legitimate revenue. Others describe changing their store layouts, keeping high-value items behind counters or in locked cases, which creates friction for honest customers and can hurt sales. In some neighbourhoods, small shops have closed entirely, with owners citing persistent theft as a contributing factor to their decision. These closures leave gaps in local communities, reducing access to goods and services, particularly in areas that were already underserved. The cumulative effect is a retail environment under pressure, where the cost of doing business increases while the ability to operate freely and openly decreases. This isn't just about financial losses on spreadsheets. It's about the gradual erosion of the normal functioning of commercial spaces. The sense that stores can no longer operate with the openness and accessibility they once could. When we look at the data available on retail theft, we need to be careful about drawing overly dramatic conclusions, but we also can't ignore what the figures suggest. Recent industry reports indicate that theft and loss prevention have become increasingly significant concerns for retailers across the United Kingdom. Trade associations representing both large chains and independent stores have published figures showing rises in reported incidents over recent years. These numbers vary depending on the sector, the region, and the methodology used to track them, so any single statistic should be understood in context rather than treated as definitive. What's consistent across different sources, however, is the direction of the trend. Whether we're looking at convenience stores, supermarkets, fashion retailers, or pharmacies, the pattern points toward growing pressure. Some reports focus on the financial impact, estimating aggregate losses in the hundreds of millions of pounds annually. Others focus on the frequency of incidents, noting increases in the number of reported thefts per store. Still, others examine the changing nature of these incidents, observing that what was once primarily opportunistic shoplifting has, in some cases, evolved into more organised or repeated behaviour. The data also reveals geographic variation, with some urban areas experiencing higher rates than others, though few regions appear entirely unaffected. What these figures collectively suggest is that retail theft has become a more persistent and widespread challenge than it was a decade ago. The numbers alone don't tell us why this is happening, but they do confirm that the phenomenon captured in security footage isn't merely anecdotal. It's measurable, it's documented, and it's something the retail sector is actively grappling with. Understanding why prevention efforts struggle requires recognizing the practical realities that retailers face. Store staff are not law enforcement officers. They're salespeople, cashiers, stock clerks, individuals hired to facilitate commerce, not to confront potentially dangerous situations. Most major retailers have implemented policies that explicitly prohibit employees from physically stopping suspected thieves. These policies exist for sound reasons, protecting staff from harm and protecting companies from liability. But they also create a situation where theft can proceed largely unchallenged. Security personnel, where they're present, face similar constraints. Their role is typically to observe, deter, and report, not to make arrests or use force. In many stores, particularly smaller independent ones, there's no dedicated security at all, just regular staff trying to manage multiple responsibilities simultaneously. Technology offers some solutions. Surveillance cameras are now ubiquitous, but cameras alone don't prevent theft. They document it. The footage is useful for evidence if someone is caught and prosecuted, but it doesn't stop the immediate act. More advanced systems, including AI-powered monitoring and item tagging, are expensive to implement and maintain, placing them out of reach for many smaller retailers. There's also the challenge of balancing security with customer experience. Stores want to feel welcoming and accessible, not like fortresses. Every additional security measure, every locked case or security gate creates friction for legitimate shoppers and potentially drives them elsewhere. Retailers are caught in a difficult position, needing to protect their inventory while also maintaining an environment that encourages people to shop. Finding that balance becomes harder when theft is frequent enough that security concerns begin to dominate operational decisions. The role of police in addressing retail theft is complicated by competing demands and limited resources. Law enforcement agencies face constant pressure to prioritise violent crimes, serious offences, and immediate public safety threats. Retail theft, particularly when individual incidents involve relatively low-value items, often falls lower on the priority list. This isn't about police not caring. It's about the reality of operating with finite resources in environments where they're pulled in multiple directions simultaneously. Officers might respond to a call about an ongoing theft, but by the time they arrive, the individual has usually left. Investigating after the fact requires time and effort that might be directed toward cases with more serious consequences or higher likelihood of successful prosecution. There's also the challenge of evidence and identification. Even with clear security footage, identifying and locating suspects takes investigative work. If the same individual commits multiple low-value thefts across different stores, building a case that justifies the resource investment becomes more viable. But tracking these patterns across jurisdictions and retail chains requires coordination that doesn't always happen seamlessly. The legal system adds another layer of complexity. Even when suspects are identified and arrested, prosecution decisions must weigh the severity of the offence against court capacity and likely outcomes. For first-time offenders or cases involving small amounts, the result might be a warning, a fine, or community service, consequences that don't necessarily deter repeat behaviour. For individuals committing retail theft repeatedly, the cumulative impact might eventually lead to more serious charges, but that process can take time, during which the pattern continues. None of this suggests that law enforcement or the legal system is failing, but it does illustrate that enforcement operates within constraints, balancing resources, priorities, and legal thresholds that shape what's practically achievable. Officers face competing demands every day, and retail theft, however frustrating for store owners, must be weighed against everything else requiring attention. So why does this pattern persist? Why does retail theft keep repeating itself despite awareness, despite security measures, despite legal consequences? The answer lies not in any single cause, but in how multiple factors converge to create an environment where the behaviour continues. There's the perception of low risk, shaped by experiences or observations that suggest the likelihood of immediate consequences is minimal. There's the reality of delayed response, where the gap between an incident occurring and any intervention happening is often wide enough that the act can be completed without interruption. There's the predictability of the environment itself. Stores operate in consistent ways, with similar layouts, similar staffing patterns, similar security measures, creating a setting where someone inclined to steal can identify patterns and opportunities. There's the economic dimension, where individuals facing financial pressure, whether from poverty, addiction, or other circumstances, calculate that the potential gain outweighs the perceived risk. There's the social dimension, where behaviours that become more common can start to feel more normalised, less exceptional, particularly in communities where people see it happening regularly without apparent consequences. None of these factors alone would be sufficient, but together they create a reinforcing cycle. Each successful theft without immediate consequence reinforces the perception that it's a viable option. Each limitation in prevention or enforcement reinforces the sense that the risk is manageable. Each repetition makes the behaviour feel less extraordinary and more routine. This is what happens when multiple pressures align, when systemic limitations intersect with individual decisions, when the cost-benefit calculation tilts in a particular direction often enough that a pattern emerges and sustains itself. It's not about any one person or any one cause. It's about how a complex system, with all its constraints and realities, produces outcomes that no single actor intended, but that emerge from the interaction of many factors. There are discussions happening about how to respond to this situation, conversations among retailers, law enforcement, policymakers, and communities about what might help. Some focus on technology, exploring more sophisticated surveillance systems, better integration of security footage across stores, AI-driven monitoring that can identify suspicious behavior patterns in real time. Others emphasize store design, rethinking layouts to reduce blind spots, positioning high-value items in more visible or secured locations, creating environments that subtly discourage theft through strategic planning. There's interest in greater cooperation between retailers and police, developing better systems for sharing information, coordinating responses, building cases against repeat offenders more effectively. Some advocate for addressing root causes, investing in social services, addiction treatment, and economic support that might reduce the underlying pressures that drive some individuals toward theft in the first place. There's no consensus on which approach is most effective, and there's certainly no single fix that will resolve everything. Different solutions work better in different contexts, for different types of stores, in different communities. What seems clear is that purely reactive approaches, simply responding to incidents as they occur, haven't been sufficient to break the cycle. Something more comprehensive, more coordinated, more proactive is needed. But implementing such approaches takes time, resources, and sustained commitment from multiple parties. The conversation is happening, but translating that conversation into meaningful change across thousands of retail locations and hundreds of communities is a slow process. What's worth reflecting on as we consider all of this is what happens when a problem becomes routine. When something that should be exceptional starts to feel normal. When store workers expect it, when security footage documents it regularly, when communities see it and barely react anymore. There's a danger in normalization, in accepting as inevitable something that doesn't have to be. Retail theft isn't an unsolvable mystery. It's a complex problem with multiple contributing factors, yes, but it's also something that changes in policy, practice, and priority could address more effectively. The question is whether there's sufficient will, sufficient resources, and sufficient coordination to make those changes happen. The footage keeps rolling, the incidents keep occurring, and the pattern persists. Until something shifts, until the factors that enable this cycle are disrupted or altered, we're likely to keep seeing the same scenes play out across UK high streets. Different stores, different faces, same basic dynamic. The challenge now is figuring out how to change that dynamic, how to break a cycle that has become all too predictable. Because the cost of letting it continue, to retailers, to communities, to the basic functioning of commercial spaces, is too significant to simply accept as the new normal.